Item number 24, Predation Management Fiscal Year 2016 Report, Wildlife Staff Specialist Pat Jackson and Game Division Administrator Brian Wakeling. Informational, the Game Division will present the status of the 2016 Predation Management Report per Commission Policy 23. The Department shall prepare an annual Predation Management Status Report detailing results of the previous fiscal year's projects. The status report shall be presented at the last commission meeting of each calendar year. Mr. Jackson, Mr. Wakeling.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Brian Wakeling, Game Division Administrator with the Nevada Department of Wildlife. I wanted to give you just a real brief overview regarding our expenditures from the prior year before we get into the details of each individual project. As it was detailed within the memo that accompanied the plan or the report itself. We did have a statute that was adopted during the development of the plan that governed this. That plan was the 2016 plan. AB 78, as it was called while it was in the legislature, dictates that 80% of the money raised during the last year for which we had complete data on the finances, that it would be based on that 80%, and so that 80% would have been off of fiscal year 2014 revenues. As we developed the plan to go forward for that fiscal year, the 2016 fiscal year, the plan had not yet, or the AB 78 had not been fully adopted. It had not been signed into statute at that time. Consequently, the plan was adopted prior to the enacting of the legislation. We tried to anticipate what we thought would be coming forth. We did not fully anticipate all of the aspects of it, and so we do want to acknowledge that we did not spend the full amount that the statute dictated. We spent $312,175 on lethal management, and that was only 54.7% of the revenue that we received in 2014. It fell short of the 80% that the AB 78 dictated. In addition, we also want to acknowledge that there may be some additional challenges moving forward this year. We have a plan in place for fiscal year 17. We're not here to report on that, but I just want to acknowledge that one of our primary cooperators that we work with on contract is Wildlife Services. Wildlife Services did have a settlement agreement with Wild Earth Guardians this year, and what that amounted to is that until they complete a new environmental assessment on their activities, they would not conduct lethal removal for wildlife management purposes. They could still do so for public safety, but not for routine management issues within wilderness areas or wilderness study areas. And so this may limit our ability into the future to actually meet that as well. We've got plans in place to try to achieve that, but I do want to fully disclose that as we go into that. This is a report that's based off of the fiscal year 2016 plan. The plan that the Commission most recently adopted in May of this last year was the 2017 plan. And so it oftentimes becomes confusing to members of the public. When we're working on the 2016 plan, we're working off the 2014 revenues, and then we'll shortly thereafter be reporting on another plan at another time. So just trying to keep everybody on the same page. This is the 2016 report off of the 2016 plan that was adopted a year and a half ago. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Pat Jackson, the Predator Staff Specialist within the Game Division.
Pat Jackson, Staff Specialist for the record. Just to go over the $3 predator fee a little bit, it generates approximately $550,000 a year. That's a fee tacked on to all big game and turkey tags. Of that, $14,000 goes to the Nevada Department of Agriculture for administration support. It's then predominantly used for predator plans approved by the Commission in the annual predator report. It's also used for staff salary and overhead, and the reserve remains in the $3 predator fee account. It does not revert back to general funds. Recently, we've seen a use and change and now acceptable uses for the $3 predator fee in regards to the plans within the predator management plan can be the management of predatory wildlife, research on lethal techniques of predatory wildlife, or the protection of sensitive species. So this fiscal year 2016 budget summary, you can see that we had $368,000 for the fiscal year 2014. And therefore, we needed to spend a little over $456,000 to reach that 80% mandate. We came in just under 55%. We spent a little over $675,000 total, of which almost $170,000 was from federal aid. Getting into the projects, Project 21 is greater sage-grouse protection via common raven removal. The purpose of this project is to reduce raven abundance temporarily at or near sage-grouse slecking and nesting sites to increase their nest success. We receive a depredation permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service currently for 2,500 ravens a year, and we collaborate with Wildlife Services to conduct those removals. We contact area biologists to see who has the most ravens and who believes they have the largest issue, and then we send Wildlife Services into those areas. And you can see on this project of the 2,500 we're allowed to take, Wildlife Services took 2,319 ravens. We also, in this past fiscal year, purchased and deployed 5 Argos and 2 GSM transmitters. These are GPS transmitters that fit on birds. Technology has just recently become available to create a GPS transmitter small and light enough to attach to a bird the size of a raven. And so we tried Argos that communicate directly with satellite, and GSM actually transmit their locations via cell phone service just to see which one would work better. And I don't know how well this is showing up, but basically the red polygons are the winter home ranges of ravens, and the blue polygons are the summer home ranges of ravens. So this really shows how confined they are during parts of the year and how much they forage during others. We also had another raven go from Midas, where we deployed all of these, all the way down to Pahrump, where it died for unknown reasons. Under Project 21, we also finished an exclosure at the Midas transfer station that had been started in prior fiscal years. It was a contractor artistic fence, and we finished having a top put on that. And talking to the local residents and also looking at our raven transmitter data, ravens no longer use this, and it used to be a very large human subsidy. I should mention that our permit from the Fish and Wildlife Service requires us to conduct non-lethal removal, and so we consider both of these actions a part of that. And you can see here, these are the tables that I made to describe expenditures. We had of the $3 predator fee expenditures, $78,000 budgeted. Due to the lethal components of this project, it does not qualify for Pittman-Robertson funds, and we spent a little over $106,000. Project 2102 is a little more of a research project that's conducted in the Virginia mountains, a collaboration with us, Wildlife Services, and the USGS to remove ravens and determine the effects on greater sage-grouse. I reported on some USG work that was not funded with the $3 predator fee, and I just provide some really brief bullets on that report. But they, with a VHF transmitter, marked an additional 13 grouse, and then followed 37 that were already wearing transmitters. 4 out of 15 nests failed. They monitored broods, and then they also conducted common raven and raptor surveys. The USGS also provided a report, a preliminary report, that is in the appendix of the predator management report, and it used a lot of historical raven data that they had from previous years to look at raven densities, and it's kind of an example of what this current fiscal year, Project 41, will be reporting on throughout the state. So this is another movement of non-lethal work looking at managing the common raven issue. And To meet our 2,500, Wildlife Services removed 181 ravens. They've been removing ravens in this area for several years. Project 22 is an umbrella project, and it used to have sub-projects. I'll report on those this year. This fiscal year, we actually just removed sub and just reported on projects. These funds spent by Wildlife Services were actually for Project 2102 that I'm about to report on. So the total by project's a little confusing. You can add that little over 8,000 to the next project total for Wildlife Services expenditures. Project 2102 is the removal of mountain lions to protect California bighorn sheep. In doing so, Wildlife Services removed 11 lions total, 6 in 011 and 5 in 013. This year, at least with marked individuals and surveys both on the ground and in the air, we did not record any mountain lion predation on marked sheep or find any unmarked sheep. There was one known predation event on a young ram that occurred from coyotes. You can see that we had $45,000 budgeted and we spent a little over $64,000. Project 22074 is a very similar project to 2201. Basically, it's removing mountain lions to protect sheep in 074, and then we also attempted to collect data for the diet analysis to determine if the resident mountain lions in that area were not consuming sheep or what they were primarily eating. The Wildlife Service did not conduct any work in this area this year. A private contractor did. However, no mountain lions were removed. Their contract report is in the appendix of the Predator Management Plan, and at this time less than 15 bighorn sheep are known in 074. On the diet analysis part, Wildlife Services in the prior fiscal year conducted mountain lion removal, removed 3 mountain lions, and did a very thorough job of collecting us hair, blood, tissue, and whisker samples. They had a centrifuge in the field and a way to freeze those samples once they were separated, and they got them to us promptly, which we turned those over to UNR to look at the stable isotope signatures of those lions. What I can tell you is that the lions were eating different things. What I can't tell you is what those different things were. The logistics and focus of this project shifted from one fiscal year to the next, and so we did not collect any prey base to look at the prey base stable isotope signatures. Project 2216 was looking at the effect of coyote den density on mule deer fawns and other wildlife species. We purchased 120 trail cameras to start conducting an occupancy study and deployed 37 during the winter months, and then the scope of this project actually wasn't changed, it was canceled, and so we ceased field work. Project 32, these following 5 slides are not mine. They're Dr. John Beckman's of the Wildlife Conservation Society, just letting you know. Project 32 is a collaboration with Wildlife Conservation Society and the Nevada Department of Wildlife. It's been going on for several years now. We're both interested in black bear recolonization of Nevada. Black bears used to inhabit a large part of the state. They were extirpated. Mountain lions were not. And now black bears are slowly recolonizing from the Sierra front, and we're interested in how mountain lions killing a deer, and then before they can fully consume it, a black bear kicking it off so that the bear itself can eat it. That does happen, but what does that mean as far as diet of both species and also the impact on mule deer? As I said, this is an ongoing project. So this past year we collared, I'm sorry, my notes weren't here, as I thought they were, 4 lions in the Carson and 2 in the Great Basin ranges, so deployed an additional 6 GPS transmitters with proximity devices, and then we also attached another 11 transmitters on bears that also have proximity devices. Proximity devices are new to the technology world, and they're functioning fairly well. Basically, a collar it's always a cost-benefit analysis on how long that collar will live, on how many points you want to take a day. So with a fairly reserved collection schedule, once an animal, a mountain lion wearing a proximity collar and a black bear wearing a proximity collar come within 200 meters of one another, going from a fairly reserved, I believe it's around 8 points a day. It actually starts collecting a point every 15 seconds so that we can increase our understanding of how those two animals interact. And to date, we've collected over 1,000 documented predation sites on mountain lions, and this past year we collected an additional 150, and so that's going to kill sites determined from the GPS data on mountain lions, and then determining what did the mountain lion eat, and then attempting to determine if it finished consuming its prey or if it was kicked off. And this project does qualify for Pittman-Robertson funds, and so of a $160,000 budget, we spent just over $100,000. Project 35, using genetics to test the identity of origin of red fox. This project was started before I began with Nevada Department of Wildlife, but over the course of the project, 241 high elevation scats were collected, and then 52 tissue samples were collected primarily from lower elevation animals, and those were mainly from roadkill and trappers, while the 241 scat samples were collected from a UC Davis graduate student. And the origin of this project, I should say, was an interest in native red fox versus a European invasive red fox that escaped at some point in time ago from fur farms that tend to live at lower elevations, while native red fox live at higher elevations. UC Davis did submit us a final report, which is the report for Project 35 in the fiscal year 2016 Predator Report. Some of the larger findings: no genetically pure fox exist in Nevada, according to what they've discovered. And then the work that was conducted in Nevada is part of an interstate collaboration with California, Idaho, Nevada, and Utah, and that report will be provided approximately February 2017. I spoke to the PI, Benjamin Sachs, this last week, and he'll make that report available, which we'll upload to the website. Project 37, the big game protection of mountain lions. This allows us to respond promptly to mountain lion predation on big game around the state, contacting area biologists. We had some mountain lion predation identified in the snowstorms. GPS transmitters were attached to sheep to look at super shredder issues, and we had quite a bit of lion predation. So with a private contractor, we went in and removed 2 mountain lions there. To my understanding, no marked animals have died since then. And then 2 mountain lions were also removed by Wildlife Services in Unit 115. You can see that of the $90,000 budget, we spent over almost $37,000. Project 38 is similar to 37, except it's big game protection from coyotes. Working with area biologists with the primary concern of coyotes' impacts on pronghorn, we identified some areas, and during this last fiscal year, Wildlife Services removed 417 coyotes. You can see out of a $90,000 budget, we spent a little over $107,000. Predator 39 was intended to be a predator education project, primarily with common raven education, removing subsidies from the landscape. With the Assembly Bill 78 changing how funds could be spent, predator education was removed from that, and so we spent no funds on this project. And Project 40 is a multifaceted management project in Eureka County intended to complement work that has been done in the past. That's habitat improvement, a BLM feral horse roundup, and some other predator removal that's occurred in previous years. And so over the course of the year, 516 coyotes and 1 badger was removed. And Mike Podborny, before he retired, wrote up a small report that is in that predator report, and he did acknowledge that since approximately when the predator removal began in 2009, the fawn to adult ratios for mule deer in the Diamond Mountains have been improving. And that table is incorrect, but I can tell you that we spent about $90,000 on that project. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Questions from the commission? Commissioner Barnes?
I guess one question I had is that you stated that you only spent 55% of the 80. are there any consequences that go along with that, or that could come because of it?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Barnes, as I indicated in the cover memo, one of the legislators at least has indicated that they recognize that there is likely to be a transition period, but there were no specific penalties in the statute as it was passed. However, it's certainly not our intent, nor is it our intent now to ignore that mandate. It's our intent to do everything we possibly can to achieve it in the future.
So they're going to give us a little time to, you say, the transition period then?
My impression was that that there was probably considered that, especially since the plan was adopted before the bill was signed into law, a year was probably a reasonable transition period.
Vice Chairman Johnston.
I'm trying to go from memory, but we've since adopted a plan following the passage of AB 78, which we'll be getting the report on next year, so that we actually developed a plan after this one in an effort to comply with AB 78. So I think there had to have been an understanding that this plan was already in place when the legislation was adopted.
Commissioner Omberg.
What happens to the unspent funds that are earmarked for lethal?
Pat Jackson, Staff Specialist for the record. They go into a reserve that has about $500,000 in it now to be spent in future years.
Vice Chairman Johnson.
I'll just comment on that. I know when we looked at developed the most recent predator management plan that we're not hearing about today, we noticed that reserve amount was growing and that we would have to start undertaking efforts to address that issue, given the legislative mandate and different things. What else can we do as part of the program?
Commissioner Valentine, then Commissioner Hubbs.
Brian, you indicated that Wildlife Services there's a litigation issue going on and they're not available at this time?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Valentine, Brian Wakeling, there was a settlement agreement with Wild Earth Guardians regarding the conduct of a lot of aspects that Wildlife Services conducts, lethal removal of predators. The primary effect that it has on our activities is the removal of wildlife, predatory wildlife within wilderness and wilderness study areas. That's the primary effect. What that requires is that Wildlife Services conduct another comprehensive EA to address that within the wilderness areas, and so they've initiated the full EA to go through the whole process and look at their programmatic process once again. When you're going through an environmental assessment of any sort, it's extremely difficult, and it probably would be considered pre-decisionary for Wildlife Services or anybody to predict an outcome of how long it's going to take to go through that. Looking at what these routinely take, a year and a half to 2.5 years certainly seems to be the range of what we've seen, but it's really hard to predict when a final decision would be rendered on that.
So if I understand correctly, then that has only an effect on the wildlife or on the wilderness areas.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Valentine, it's wilderness and wilderness study areas. And so there are quite a few of those throughout Nevada and within some of the areas where at this point in time we're certainly still considering predation management activities.
Commissioner Hubbs.
Yes, I had a couple questions. The first was, I noticed two projects that we actually removed quite a few coyotes from Project 38 and Project 40. I don't know exactly where those areas are, but I know Project 38 was looking at pronghorn populations, and then, of course, Project 40 was a mule deer. And you said on the ground, after the removal of 515 coyotes, that there was an increase in fawns, but also in the same project, there were a lot of other factors at issue there, those being the feral horse issues, the pinyon juniper issues. And I guess my question and concern in that area is, you know, some of the information that's been put forward to this commission from the academic environment has said, well, if we remove 515 coyotes, that could potentially create some type of sink that will be filled, and it may impact nearby coyote into actually breeding or producing more pups to fill those areas. I'm not sure how legitimate that is, but I'm thinking of that as we remove that quantity of coyotes. And then also, are we taking a look at those other factors? From what I've heard, the feral horses can have a much greater impact on mule deer too, in terms of competing for resources. And so I just was wondering if in those studies we're looking at it collectively and trying to assess all data, just to understand if that's really the management tool that best addresses the, you know, boosting those mule deer numbers there. That's one of my first questions, so I'll stop there because it's kind of long.
Pat Jackson, Predator Management Staff Specialist for the record. Project 38 and Project 40 were earmarked as implementation projects, and I don't have the 2016 Predator plan in front of me. However, if you read the definition of implementation, often they're done on a short notice, but they're also done in saying that we may not be collecting data to make inference on those results. So as far as Project 38 goes, with the removal of coyotes for pronghorn benefit, we do have several peer-reviewed articles of literature that support that type of activity. And as far as Project 40 goes, we are not collecting any sort of data on habitat or feral horses.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Wakeling, if I could elaborate on that just a bit. Another aspect of AB 78, when that part of that bill dictates that 80% of the dollars should be used to conduct lethal removal. What it doesn't really address too broadly is what constitutes lethal removal. And so we get a great deal of interpretation from both sides of the island that may choose to support or oppose the use of predation management, that either that means, unless we're actually in the process of lethally removing a predator, or if we're in the, anything associated with it, a research study could be considered as a legitimate expenditure. That same legislator, there was some, former Commissioner Chad Bliss read something into the record, I believe it was at the June Commission meeting, that largely, May or June, and largely spoke to how that one legislator viewed that interpretation and left the inference on how far that could go to the Commission. They thought that the Commission made an appropriate discretion on that point. As we go through these and as we develop the plans, our intent is to identify whether or not it's going to be, the monitoring is going to be at a rigorous level, in which case we would look at it as a research project, and in which case the monitoring in those situations could very well far exceed the amount that we expend on the lethal removal aspect of it. As Mr. Jackson pointed out, this was designed to be an implementation project. We have no doubt that the removal of feral horses, we have no doubt that the habitat enhancements all contributed to the improvement and the enhancement of the fawn recruitment in that area. But we intended for this to be an implementation where we were trying to address, and in fact, the policy 23 that governs this actually encourages the department to look at places where we can piggyback on all these other projects to get the biggest benefit for the expenditures that we're making. And so, in this case, it is not a rigorous monitoring. It was a implementation project, and we did use our existing monitoring, looking at Fonda Doe ratios, to see if cumulatively we were having an effect. But we're not able to tease out the various aspects of that.
The other areas that I, of course, honed in on were some of the areas in which mountain lions were removed. The first one being 2201, which showed that there were 11 mountain lions removed there for enhancement of California bighorn sheep populations. And did we see a bump in numbers in response to those removals?
Pat Jackson, Predator Management Staff Specialist for the record. What we did see is that no marked bighorn sheep were consumed by mountain lions that year. Talking to Chris Hampson, the area biologist, he does believe that population is stable or increasing. And this current fiscal year, we will be putting out more GPS transmitters on sheep to monitor their survival.
Thank you.
Anything further from the commission? Seeing none, I think since we started so early this morning, we're going to take a 45-minute lunch break. And we'll be back here at 12:45. And what I'm going to do is, if we can get 5 commissioners here, for sure, we're going to start, because we have a lot of stuff left to go today. So do your best to be back here in 45, but that's what we're going to do. So.